3 weeks after inheriting my grandfather's cabin, the HOA president stood on my dock and told me I couldn't fish on my own property. The lake was a community amenity. Fishing violated new regulations. $200 a day if I didn't comply. She smiled. We've already started treatment. The lake will look much better in a few weeks. Margaret didn't know that 70 years earlier, the county filed an easement designating that lake as a municipal water source. 150 homes, 6 wells, 1 underground pipe system, all pulling drinking water from the lake sheet. Just dumped industrial chemicals into. She thought she was enforcing standards, protecting property values. She thought a permit and a brother-in-law at the county office gave her authority to do whatever she wanted. She was wrong. By the time she realized what she'd done, it was too late to stop what happened next. But let me start from the beginning. Before we dive into, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons for more interesting stories just like this. 3 weeks ago, my grandfather Samuel died at 91. Funeral was small. He'd outlived most of his friends, and afterward, his attorney handed me a key in a FedEx envelope. Attached was a note in Samuel's shaky handwriting. The lake remembers everything. So should you. I thought it was just old man sentiment. Poetic, nostalgic, the kind of thing you write when you know you're running out of time. Samuel had always been like that, cryptic, thoughtful, never saying exactly what he meant. I inherited his property. A small 2-bedroom cabin on 2 acres with a private spring-fed lake. I hadn't visited in 15 years. Life got busy. Work piled up. You know how it goes, but I remembered every summer I spent there as a kid. Fishing off the dock, swimming in water so clear you could see the bottom 20 feet down, campfires. At night, while Samuel told stories about buying the land back in 1954, back when it was just woods and farmland and silence, I took the week off work and drove 4 hours south on Thursday afternoon to sort through his things. The cabin looked exactly the same when I pulled into the gravel driveway. Weathered cedar, siding gone silver gray, a stone chimney that leaned slightly left, a screened porch facing the water. Samuel's truck was still parked under the oak tree, covered in pollen. For a second, I half expected him to walk out the front door with a cup of coffee and a fishing rod. But the land around the cabin had changed. Up the hill, where there used to be thick forest, there were now houses, maybe 150, of them built in neat suburban rows with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. They were newer construction, probably 1980s through early 2000s. Painted in safe colors, beige, gray, cream. The top of the hill, a stone entrance sign read, Clearwater Estates, a planned community, an HOA neighborhood. I didn't think much of it at the time. The lake itself looked perfect, 3 acres of crystal clear. Water with a heron hunting in the shallows and fish jumping near the lily pads. The air smelled like pine and water and warm earth. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something loosen in my chest. I unlocked the cabin and spent an hour walking through Samuel's life. His fishing rod stood in the corner by the door, still rigged with lures. His coffee mug sat in the dish drainer. On the mantel, a photo showed him holding a 6-pound bass, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. I remembered that die. Was 8 standing just out of frame, holding the net? The cabin smelled like him, with smoke, coffee, old paper. I felt the grief hit me then, sharp and sudden. I had to sit down on the couch for a minute and just breathe. By late afternoon, I needed air. I grabbed Samuel's old rod fiberglass, cork handle worn smooth from decades of use, and walked down to the dock. The boards creaked under my feet, familiar and solid. I tied on a plastic worm, cast it out toward the cattails, and let the weight sink. The water was so clear I could watch the lure disappear into the green shadows 20 feet down. 2 casts later, I felt the hit sharp, aggressive, the rod bending hard. I set the hook and reeled in a 2-pound largemouth bass, dark green and healthy, fighting all the way to the dock. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight, then slipped it back into the water and watched it dart away. It felt like being a kid again, like Samuel was standing beside me, saying, "There you go. Nice and easy. 20 minutes later, I caught another one, smaller but just as strong. I was reaching for a third cast when I heard the whine of an electric motor behind me. Golf cart came speeding down the gravel driveway, bouncing hard over the ruts, and skidded to a stop near the cabin. A woman climbed out mid-50s, sharp-featured, wearing a white polo shirt with an embroidered logo that read Clearwater Estates HOA. She had a tablet in one hand and the expression of someone who'd just caught a trespasser. "Excuse me?" she shouted, marching toward the dock. "You can't fish here." I turned, still holding the rod. "I'm sorry, what?" She stopped at the edge of the dock, hands on her hips. "Fishing is prohibited. This is a community amenity, and we have rules." Set the rod down carefully. "This is my property. I just inherited it." Her eyes narrowed. "You're Samuel's grandson?" "That's right. I'm Margaret Westfield, president of the Clearwater Estates Homeowners Association." She said it like a military rank. "I'm sorry for your loss, but the rules still apply. Fishing is prohibited under new safety and aesthetic regulations." I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. "My grandfather fished here for 70 years. Your grandfather is gone," she said flatly. "The rules have changed." Felt heat rising in my chest. But I kept my voice calm. "This is a private lake on private property. Your HOA doesn't govern what I do here." Margaret pulled out her tablet, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it toward me. HOA Covenant Amendment, approved in 2024. Section 14.3, no fishing, swimming, or recreational water use in community water features. Violations are subject to fines of $200 per day. "This isn't a community water feature," I said slowly. "It's my lake. My grandfather owned this land before your neighborhood even existed. Your property is part of Clearwater Estates," she said, her tone clipped and bureaucratic. "The HOA governs all water features within the subdivision for safety and aesthetic purposes. If you fish here again, you'll be fined." I looked at the lakeclear.com alive with fish and birds, then back at her. "You're serious, completely." She tucked the tablet under her arm. "The lake is an eyesore. We're taking steps to improve community standards." "An eyesore?" I gestured at the water. "It's pristine. It's spring-fed. It's been here longer than any of those houses. It attracts wildlife. It's unregulated. It doesn't align with the neighborhood's aesthetic vision." Her voice was cold, matter of fact, like she was reading from a script. She walked back to her golf cart and grabbed a bottle of water from the cup holder, some expensive brand, filtered, store-bought. She twisted it open and took a sip. I pointed toward the cabin. "You want a glass of tap water? I can get you some." She wrinkled her nose like I'd offered her swamp water. "No thanks. I only drink filtered." The way she said it, sharp, dismissive. Certain stuck with me. It wasn't just preference. It was like she knew something about the water I didn't. Like she'd already made a decision about it, and I wasn't part of the conversation. "Margaret," I said, trying to stay reasonable, "what do you mean by taking steps? What exactly are you planning to do?" She smiled. It was thin, tight, calculated. "You'll see. We've already started treatment." "Treatment for what?" "Algae, weeds, aesthetic concerns." She climbed into the golf cart and started the motor. "The lake will look much better in a few weeks." "More controlled? Controlled?" I repeated. "It's a natural lake." "Exactly," she said. Then she drove off. Disappearing up the hill toward the rows of identical houses, I stood there on the dock, rod still in hand, trying to make sense of what just happened. She'd threatened me with fines for fishing on my own property. She'd called a pristine spring-fed lake an eyesore. And she'd said we've already started treatment, past tense. Like it was already done, like I was too late to stop it. That night, I lay in Samuel's bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation. The way she'd smiled when she said, "You'll see," the bottle of filtered water, a phrase more controlled, the certainty in her voice when she refused to tap water. Around midnight, I got up and walked out onto the porch. The lake was calm under the full moon, glowing pale silver. Peaceful. Perfect. I went back to bed the next morning. Woke to the smell of chemicals. It was sharp, acidic, wrong like bleach or industrial cleaner. The smell was coming through. The open window carried on the breeze from the lake thick enough that I could taste it, metallic and bitter on my tongue. I pulled on jeans and a t-shirt and walked outside. The lake's surface had changed. There was a faint oily sheen near the shore, catching the early light in sick rainbow patterns. And floating near the dock, maybe a dozen dead fish. Bass, bluegill, a catfish. Belly up, eyes clouded, gills wide. I walked down to the dock, my stomach sinking. A 2-pound bass floated near the piling side, probably caught his grandfather. Right here 20 years ago, the smell was stronger here, a mix of rotting fish and something bitter, chemical. I knelt and touched the water. It felt slick, oily, wrong. Near the shore, half hidden in the cattails, I spotted industrial plastic containers, the kind you'd use for pool chemicals or pesticides. They were empty, labels torn off, tossed carelessly into the brush like someone had tried to hide them, but didn't care enough to do it well. Margaret hadn't just threatened me yesterday, she'd already poisoned the lake. I stood up slowly, staring at the dead fish floating in water that 24 hours ago had been crystal clear. Water where I'd caught to base. Water where Samuel had fished for 70 years. Water where I'd learned to cast a line as a kid, where I'd scattered my grandmother's ashes, where 3 generations of my family had built memories, and now it was dead. Margaret Westfield had killed it. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and started taking photos. The dead fish, the oily sheen, the empty chemical containers. I didn't know what I was going to do with them yet, but I knew I needed evidence. Samuel's note flashed through my mind. The lake remembers everything. So should you. I didn't understand it when I first read it, but standing there on the dock, staring at a poisoned lake and a dozen dead fish, I was starting to think Samuel hadn't left me a sentimental note. He'd left me a warning, which meant he'd fought this battle before me and lost by noon. The lake was a graveyard. What started as a dozen dead fish in the morning had become hundreds by midday. They floated everywhere: bass, bluegill, catfish, even a few carp I hadn't seen in years. Species that had lived here for decades, gone in a single night. The smell was unbearable, a thick mix of rotting flesh and bitter chemicals that hung in the air like fog. I tied a bandana over my nose and mouth, but it didn't help much. The herons were gone. The turtles that used to sun themselves on the fallen log near the far bank dawn. Even the dragonflies had disappeared. The animals knew what I was just starting to understand. This water was poison now. I walked the shoreline, documenting everything. With my phone, near the cattails on the north side, I found more evidence: industrial chemical containers, half hidden in the brush like someone had tried to conceal them but gave up halfway through. I pulled one out and read the label: copper, sulfate, algezide. Another one: aquatic herbicide, commercial grade. Both were empty, caps off, tossed carelessly into the weeds. Margaret's people had dumped this directly into the water. I took photos of the containers, the labels, the serial numbers. Then I called County Environmental Services. The woman who answered sounded tired. Environmental Services. This is Linda. I need to report a chemical spill. Someone dumped industrial chemicals into a private lake, hundreds of dead fish. What's the address? I gave her the details. She asked if there was immediate human health risk. I told her I didn't know the lake was spring-fed, and I wasn't sure where the water went after it left here. I'll send Inspector Dale out Monday. Monday. That's 3 days away. We're short-staffed, she said, her tone apologetic but firm. If it's not a human health risk, it's lower priority. I hung up and stared at the dead lake. 3 more days of rotting fish, 3 more days of chemicals leaching into the soil and water. 3 more days for Margaret to cover her tracks. That afternoon, a mail carrier handed me a certified letter. I signed for it, already knowing what it was. The envelope had the Clearwater Estates HOA logo in the corner. I opened it right there. Notice of violation: unapproved waterfront structures. The letter claimed my dock was unpermitted and violated setback requirements. It demanded removal within 30 days and included a $500 fine. At the bottom, in bold, failure to comply will result in lien against property. Samuel had built that dock in 1960. It had been there longer than the HOA had existed. I drove up the hill to Margaret's house. She lived on Lakeview Drive, Ironic. Since her view was only possible because my property sat below hers, her house was one of the newer ones, maybe built in the late 1990s, all stone and stucco with a 3-car garage and professional landscaping. A sign in the front yard read Westfield Green Solutions Quality Landscaping. I rang the doorbell. Margaret opened the door, still wearing her HOA polo shirt. She didn't look surprised to see me. "Can I help you?" I held up the violation notice. "You poisoned my lake, and now you're fining me for having a dock." She crossed her arms. "The lake had excess algae and weeds. We treated it for the community's benefit. You killed every fish, hundreds of them. The water is toxic." "Temporary inconvenience," she said, her voice flat and bureaucratic. "The lake will recover in a few weeks and be more attractive. It's more in line with community standards." "You didn't have permission to dump chemicals on my property?" "Your property is part of the Clearwater Estates watershed. HOA has authority to manage water quality for the benefit of all residents." She said it like she'd rehearsed it. "And your dock violates setback requirements. It needs to be removed." "You can't just dump chemicals without permits," I said, trying to keep my voice level. Margaret smiled that thin, tight smile again. She pulled her phone from her pocket, tapped the screen, and turned it toward me. It was a scanned Documenta County permit, signed and stamped. The signature at the bottom read Brian Westfield, County Environmental Inspector. Westfield. I stared at the signature. "Related to you?" Her smile widened. "My brother-in-law. I approved the treatment. Fully legal." My stomach dropped. She'd rigged the system. "The chemicals meet county standards for ornamental pond treatment," she continued. "Your lake qualifies as an ornamental feature under subdivision regulations. The permit is valid. This isn't an ornamental pond. It's a natural spring-fed lake. The permit says otherwise." She tucked her phone away. "Now, about your dock. You have 30 days to remove it, or the fine increases to $100 per day. I suggest you comply." She closed the door in my face. I sat in my truck for a minute, hands shaking, trying to process what just happened. Margaret had poisoned the lake, gotten her brother-in-law to approve it, was now threatening me with fines for a dock that had been there for 60 years. I drove back to the cabin and checked my bank account. The balance made my chest tighten. I'd been laid off 2 months ago and was living on savings. The property had $8,000 in back taxes I'd inherited with the deed. Couldn't afford a legal fight. I definitely couldn't afford fines at $100 a day. I felt trapped. That evening, another certified letter arrived. I didn't even need to open it to know it was from the HOA, but I did anyway. Notice of violation, failure to maintain property standards. The letter claimed the shoreline vegetation was unsightly and inconsistent with community aesthetics. It demanded I clear the cattails, remove the fallen logs, and landscape the shore with approved native plantings. Another $300 fine, total fines, $800. And according to the letter, they'd escalate by $100 per day starting next week. My phone rang. "Unknown number," I answered. "This is Margaret Westfield." Her voice was calm, controlled. I wanted to follow up on the violation notices. I got them. "Good, I also wanted to mention that your property is ... underperforming. It depreciates the neighborhood. We're simply trying to protect property values for all residents. By poisoning my lake and threatening me with fines? By enforcing standards," she said. "If you can't afford to maintain the property at community levels, perhaps you should consider selling. I know several buyers who'd be interested in lakefront land," and there it was. She didn't just want control of the lake. She wanted the property. "I'm not selling," I said. "That's your choice, but the fines will continue until you comply. And if you don't pay them, we'll place a lien on the property. Eventually you'll lose it anyway." She paused. "Think it over." "This doesn't have to be difficult." She hung up. I sat on the porch that night, staring at the dead lake. the smell had gotten worse as the day went on. In the moonlight, I could see the white bellies of fish floating near the dock. The water that used to be crystal clear now had a dull, milky sheen. Margaret had killed it. Now she was trying to take it from me. I thought about Samuel's note. The lake remembers everything. So should you. Had he known the HOA would do this? Had Margaret threatened him to? Is that why he'd held on to the property for so long, refusing to sell, even when developers came calling? I stood up and walked inside. Samuel's files were still boxed up in the studied decades of paperwork, deeds, tax records, correspondence. I'd been planning to sort through them eventually, but I hadn't had the energy yet. Now I didn't have a choice. If Samuel had fought this battle before me, maybe he'd left proof. Something I could use to fight back. Something Margaret didn't know existed. I pulled the first box off the shelf and started digging. I found it 3 boxes deep, folder labeled Water Easement 1947. I'd spent all of Saturday digging through Samuel's files, decades of tax records, property surveys, correspondence with county offices, paperwork that smelled like dust and old ink, organized in boxes stacked in his study. I was looking for anything that could help me fight Margaret, and I'd almost given up when I pulled out that folder. Inside was a utility easement agreement, filed with the county clerk, dated March 18, 1947. The language was dense and legal. But one phrase jumped out at me. Designated as a municipal water source for the surrounding area. The lake provided drinking water to the entire neighborhood. There were surveyor's notes attached, handwritten on yellowed paper. The lake had been measured at 15,000 gallons per day flow rate. A pipe system had been installed in 1947 to channel water from the lake to a network of wells serving the farms and homes in the area. Samuel had bought the property in 1954, 7 years after the easement was filed. The lake came with the land. But the water rights, the legal designation as a municipal source, remained in effect. I sat back, hands shaking. Margaret hadn't poisoned an ornamental pond. She'd poisoned the drinking water for 150 families, including her own. I pulled up the county GIS database and found it a map of the subdivision's well network. 6 wells scattered throughout the neighborhood marked with blue dots, and connecting them thin lines representing underground pipes all traced back to my property to the lake. Every home in Clearwater Estates was drinking water that came from the lake. Margaret had dumped chemicals into. I researched state environmental law next. When I found Section 401.3, my stomach flipped. Contamination of a municipal water source was a felony, up to $50,000 in fines, up to 5 years in prison. Margaret had no idea what she'd done. I needed proof. The 1947 easement was a start, but I needed evidence that the water in the lake matched the water coming out of the taps in Clearwater Estates. I grabbed 2 clean mason jars from the kitchen, walked down to the lake, and filled one with lake water, careful to avoid the dead fish floating near the surface. Back at the cabin, filled the second jar from the kitchen tap. I found a private lab online that did water quality testing. Rush service cost $400, money I didn't really have, but I didn't have a choice. I packed the samples carefully, drove to the FedEx store, and shipped them overnight. Results promised in 5 business days. Monday morning, Inspector Dale showed up. He was in his late 40s, balding, wearing a county uniform and carrying a clipboard. He walked down to the lake, surveyed the dead fish still floating near the shore, and took photos. I showed him the empty chemical containers I'd found in the cattails. Copper, sulfate, and aquatic herbicide, he said, reading the labels. Pretty. Standard for pond treatment. This isn't a pond, I said. It's a municipal water source. Check the 1947 easement. I handed him a copy of the document. He read it slowly, frowning. It's listed in county records as a decorative pond, he said. It's not a water source. The records are wrong. The easement was filed in 1947. The lake feeds the well system for the entire neighborhood. I showed him the GIS map on my phone. 150 homes are drinking this water. Dale's frown deepened. He pulled out his own phone, made a call, and spoke quietly to someone for a few minutes. When he hung up, he looked uncomfortable. The permit for chemical treatment was signed by Brian Westfield. He's a senior county inspector. If he classified this as an ornamental pond, that's the official designation. He's Margaret Westfield's brother-in-law, I said. She got him to sign off on it. Dale's expression shifted, surprised, then cautious. That's a conflict of interest. It's corruption. Didn't respond to that. Instead, he knelt by the shore and collected his own water samples, sealing them in official county containers. I'll send these to the state lab. The lake is actually a water source, and the chemical levels exceed safe drinking standards. The permit is invalid. How long will that take? 2 weeks? Maybe 3? He stood up, brushing dirt off his knees. But I'll be honest, if Brian signed off on this, it's going to be hard to challenge. His word carries weight. He left, taking his samples with him. That afternoon, another certified letter arrived. I didn't even need to read the return address. Notice of violation, unauthorized water testing, and tampering. The letter claimed I had interfered with community water features without HOA approval, conducted unauthorized testing that could compromise water quality data. It included a $1,000 fine and a warning that further harassment of HOA board members could result in a restraining order. Margaret was escalating. Tuesday evening, there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find an older man standing. On the porch, maybe 70, gray hair, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. He had kind eyes and the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lifetime working outdoors. "Can I help you?" I asked. "I'm Ed Callahan," he said, retired county surveyor. "I helped map this area back in the 1960s. He paused. "Your grandfather and I were friends. He asked me to check on you if anything happened to him." I stared at him. "Samuel asked you to check on me?" Ed nodded. "About a year ago. He said if he passed and you inherited the property, I should make sure you knew what you were dealing with." He glanced past me toward the lake. Margaret doesn't know what she's done, does she? I invited him inside. We sat at the kitchen table, and Ed laid out a hand-drawn map, a copy of the original 1947 survey he'd helped create when he first started working for the county. It showed the lake, the pipe system, the well network, everything. "Lake is the original water source for the entire area," he explained, tracing the lines with his finger. When Clearwater Estates was built in 1983, the developer tied into the existing well system. It was cheaper than drilling new wells. The lake ownership stayed with your grandfather's property, but the water rights remained municipal. That's how it's always been. So when Margaret dumped chemicals into the lake, she poisoned the neighborhood's drinking water, Ed finished. 150 families, all connected to wells that pull from this lake. Why didn't anyone know? I asked. How did the county records get changed to decorative pond? Ed shook his head. I don't know. When I retired in 2005, it was still listed as a municipal source. Somebody changed it after that. He looked at me seriously. Your grandfather fought. Margaret, for years, she wanted to buy this property, turn it into a park or some kind of HOA amenity. He refused. She tried to get the county to reclassify the lake, but Samuel always blocked it. He knew what it really was. What happened? Asked, why did he stop fighting? Ed's expression grew sad. He got old, tired. Margaret outlasted him. I felt a stab of guilt. I should have visited more, should have helped him fight. Ed tapped the map, but he left you this. He wanted you to finish what he started. I emailed Margaret that night, attached a copy of the 1947 easement, the state law citation about contamination of municipal water sources, and a note that said, you poisoned a municipal water source. That's a felony. Penalties include $50,000 fine and up to 5 years in prison. Remove the fines and violations, or I go too. The state EPA. A response came within an hour. These are frivolous accusations based on outdated documents. The lake is classified as a decorative feature under current county records. You are in violation of multiple HOA covenants. Pay your fines by Friday, or we will place a lien on your property. Further harassment of the HOA board will result in legal action. She wasn't backing down. Friday afternoon, the lab results arrived via email. I opened the PDF with shaking hands. Lake water sample. Copper sulfate levels at 2.8 parts per million. Aquatic herbicide residue at 1.3 ppm. Both levels exceeded EPA safe drinking water standards by significant margins. Tap water sample. Copper sulfate at 2.6 ppm. Herbicide residue at 1.2 ppm. The numbers were nearly identical. The water in the lake, and the water coming out of my kitchen, tappened by extension. Every tap in Clearwater Estates were the same. Margaret had poisoned the drinking water for 150 families, and they'd been drinking it for a week. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the lab results. Margaret had no idea what she'd done. She thought she'd treated a decorative pond. She thought she was enforcing HOA standards. She didn't know she'd committed a felony. But I had the proof now. Lab results, the easement, Ed's testimony. And I was going to make sure everyone knew what she'd done. I called the local newspaper Saturday morning. Time to expose Margaret. They transferred me to Rachel Torres, environmental reporter. This is Rachel. My name's on the property deed at Clearwater Estates, I said. The HOA poisoned my lake with industrial chemicals. I need someone to cover it. There was a pause. Poison ornamental ponds all the time. It's not really a story unless there's a bigger issue. This isn't an ornamental pond, I said. It's their drinking water. Another pause. Longer this time. Explain. I sent her everything, the 1947 easement. The lab results showing identical contamination in the lake and tap water, the state law citations, photos of the dead fish. 20 minutes later, she called back. If this is true, it's a major story. She said, let me verify the facts. I'll call you back. Rachel spent the weekend digging. She pulled county records and confirmed the water lines running from my property to the subdivision's well network. Who walked her through the original 1947 survey and explained how the system worked. She checked the permit signed by Brian Westfield and discovered through public records that he was Margaret's brother-in-law. When she called me Monday morning, her voice had changed. Sharp, focused, angry. This is nepotism, environmental contamination, and a public health crisis, she said. I'm running the story. Front page, Wednesday edition. Rachel started knocking on doors in Clearwater Estates, asking residents about their water. She found more than she expected. A family on Maple Street reported their tap water had tasted strange for the past 2 weeks. Metallic. Bitter. They'd switched to bottled water but hadn't thought much of it. Another family on Oak Drive said the same thing. A couple on Elm Street mentioned their dog had gotten sick after drinking from his water bowl, vomiting for 2 days straight. Then Rachel found Marcus and Jennifer Hayes, their 7-year-old daughter. Emma had been hospitalized 10 days earlier with severe stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. The doctors ran tests but couldn't identify the cause. They'd sent her home with instructions to stay hydrated and monitor her symptoms. She was better now, but still weak. When Rachel told them about the chemical treatment, Jennifer started crying. Marquesa, union organizer in his early 40s, broad-shouldered and blunt, looked like he wanted to put his fist through a wall. Margaret never told us she was treating the lake, he said. We drink that water. My kid drinks that water. Rachel gave him my number. Marcus called me that night. I'm organizing a group, he said. 30 homeowners so far who want answers. We're calling it Residents for Accountability. Margaret's not going to get away with this. I asked Marcus to request an emergency HOA board meeting. He did. Margaret refused. Her response, sent via email to Marcus and copied to me, this matter is outside the scope of HOA governance. The board has full authority to manage water features under the covenants. Your request is denied, Marcus replied. You don't have authority to poison drinking water. Margaret's response came within minutes. Your claims are unsubstantiated and defamatory. Continued harassment of the HOA board will result in legal action. Wednesday morning, Rachel's article hit the front page of the county newspaper. HOA poisons. Own water supply. The story laid it all out. The chemical treatment. the 1947 easement, designating the lake as a municipal water source. The contaminated lab results, Brian Westfield's conflict of interest as Margaret's brother-in-law. Rachel quoted Ed Callahan explaining the well system. Marcus Hayes describing his daughter's hospitalization, me providing the documentation. The photo at the top showed dead fish floating in the lake, their white bellies stark against the murky water. The story went viral by lunchtime. Regional news picked it up. Local TV stations sent crews to Clearwater Estates. By Wednesday afternoon, the county health department had launched an emergency investigation, and the state EPA had opened a case file. Brian Westfield was placed on administrative leave pending review. Margaret called an emergency HOA board meeting. For Thursday night, more than 100 residents packed the community center. I stood in the back with Ed and Marcus, watching people file in angry, scared, confused. Some carried jugs of discolored tap water. Others held printouts of Rachel's article. Margaret stood at the front, flanked by the two other board members, a nervous-looking man named Tom and a quiet woman named Susan. Margaret's expression was tight, controlled, but I could see the cracks forming. She opened the meeting with a prepared statement. "The recent media coverage has been sensationalized and misleading," she said, her voice cold. The lake treatment was approved by a licensed county inspector. It met all legal standards for ornamental pond maintenance. The accusations being made are false and defamatory. Marcus Hayes stood up. "The inspector is your brother-in-law." Margaret's jaw tightened. "That's irrelevant. He's a professional. And my kid was hospitalized," Marcus said, his voice rising.
Out.
"She drank poisoned water because you didn't tell anyone what you were doing?" Jennifer Hayes stood next to him, holding a photo of their daughter. "You poisoned our drinking water and didn't tell us? You didn't even test it first." The treatment was for a decorative pond, Margaret insisted. "There is no connection to the drinking water supply." Ed Callahan rose slowly from his seat. Every head in the room turned toward him. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I surveyed this area in the 1960s. I helped install the well system in 1983. The lake is the water source. I have the original maps. You know this." Margaret's face went pale. "The county records." "Classify it as decorative. The county records are wrong," Ed said. "And you knew it. Samuel told you years ago." The room erupted. Residents shouted questions, accusations, demands. Margaret tried to regain control, banging a gavel on the table, but it was useless, Tom. The nervous board member leaned into the microphone. "We need to table this discussion and consult with our attorney. We need to vote her out." Someone shouted from the crowd. Margaret's face hardened. "We're not voting on anything tonight. I'm proposing an emergency assessment of $500 per household to fund legal defense against these false accusations. The HOA needs protection." "Our interests?" Marcus said, incredulous. "You poisoned us." Margaret ignored him and called for a vote on the emergency assessment. 87 residents voted no. 23 voted yes. The assessment failed. Marcus immediately stood. "I move to remove Margaret Westfield as HOA president, effective immediately." Margaret slammed the gavel down. "That's not on the agenda. Motion is out of order. Can't ignore a motion to remove you," someone yelled. "I'm adjourning this meeting." The doors at the back of the community center opened, and a woman in a state EPA uniform walked in, flanked by two men carrying clipboards. The room went silent. "Margaret Westfield?" the woman asked. Margaret nodded. Stiffly, "I'm Inspector Karen Diaz with the state EPA. I'm issuing an immediate cease and desist order on all chemical treatments of the water source on Parcel 14A. We're also mandating water quality testing at all residences in Clearwater Estates, effective immediately." She handed Margaret an official document. "Our preliminary findings indicate potential contamination of a municipal water source. This is a public health emergency." Margaret took the document with shaking hands. Her face had gone from pale to ashen. Inspector Diaz turned to address the room. "We'll be delivering bottled water to the neighborhood starting tomorrow morning. Do not drink tap water until further notice." Chaos erupted again. Parents demanded answers. Elderly residents asked how long the water had been contaminated. Inspector Diaz and her team tried to answer questions, but the noise was overwhelming. Margaret grabbed her coat and pushed toward the exit. I watched her go, her face twisted with fury and humiliation. As she reached the door, she turned back and looked directly at me. Her eyes were cold, venomous. Then she was gone. The next morning, I woke to a news alert on my phone. The state attorney general had announced a criminal investigation into the contamination of a municipal water source in Clearwater Estates. Both Margaret Westfield and Brian Westfield were named as subjects of the investigation. Brian was under investigation for improper permitting and conflict of interest violations. Margaret was under investigation for reckless endangerment and environmental contamination. My phone rang an hour later, known number. I let it go to voicemail. When I played the message, Margaret's voice came through, shaking with rage. "You've destroyed this community. You've destroyed my reputation. You've cost this neighborhood tens of thousands of dollars. I will make sure you pay for what you've done. This isn't over." I saved the voicemail and forwarded it to Rachel Torres. Margaret had just threatened me on record, and she still didn't understand that she'd done this to herself. The health department testing results came back 10 days after the EPA's emergency order. 142 homes out of 150 showed elevated copper sulfate levels in their tap water. 89 showed herbicide contamination above EPA safe limits. 23 homes, mostly those closest to my property, lower on the hill where the water pressure was strongest, had levels so high they required immediate bottled water advisories and medical screening. The county set up a hotline. Within 48 hours, they documented 7 children treated for gastrointestinal illness in the past 2 weeks. 3 elderly residents had been hospitalized with symptoms consistent with heavy metal exposure, confusion, tremors, kidney stress. One of them, an 82-year-old man named Gerald Kowalski, was still in the ICU. Dr. Amy Lau, a pediatrician at the county hospital, held a press conference. She stood at a podium with charts behind her showing copper sulfate toxicity symptoms: nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea. "These symptoms match what we've been seeing in children from Clearwater Estates," she said. "The contamination is real and it's dangerous." The hospital set up a screening clinic. Over 100 residents showed up the first day. The health department issued a mandate. All Clearwater Estates residents were ordered to use bottled water only. No drinking, no ice. The county delivered pallets of bottled water to the community center. Estimated timeline before the water would be safe to drink again: 6 to 8 weeks. Cost to the county: $85,000. Marcus Hayes and the residents for accountability. Coalition demanded a full financial audit of the HOA. Margaret refused. The residents hired an independent auditor anyway, funded by donations from the 30 families in Marcus's group. The auditor's name was Linda Ortiz. She was a forensic accountant who specialized in HOA fraud cases, and she was very, very good at her job. It took her a week to go through the HOA's books. What she found was damning. In 2023, the HOA board under Margaret's leadership had awarded a $90,000 contract to Westfield Green Solutions for a lake beautification project. The contract was never put out for competitive bid. It was approved unanimously by the 3-person board: Margaret, Susan Chen, the treasurer, and Mark Torres, the vice president. Westfield Green Solutions was Margaret's landscaping company. The contract had 2 phases. Phase 1, chemical treatment to eliminate algae and invasive vegetation. Cost $15,000. Status: completed. Phase 2, partial draining of the lake. Installation of decorative fountain and stone pathways. Upgraded lighting. Cost $75,000. Status: planned, not yet started. Margaret had been paying herself with HOA dues. Linda found emails. Lots of them. I dated November 2023. It was between Margaret and Susan Chen. Susan was Margaret's younger sister. It's a detail that hadn't been widely known in the neighborhood. Margaret's email read, "Once we treat the lake and install the fountain, property values in the lakefront section will increase 8 to 10%. Our houses benefit most. This is a smart investment. Margaret and Susan both owned homes on Lakeview Drive, the street with direct views of my property and the lake. Another email, dated January 2024, outlined the plan in more detail. Margaret wanted to drain the lake partially, eliminate the wild. Appearance? Remove the fishing habitat. Create an upscale water feature with a fountain, decorative lighting, and stone borders. The goal was to increase property values for the homes with lake views, including hers. She'd been planning this for over a year. Linda also found an email from Ed Callahan to Margaret, dated April 20-3. It read, "Margaret, before you proceed with lake treatment, please verify water source status. The 1947 easement designates this as municipal supply. Chemical treatment could contaminate drinking water. Please confirm with county records before moving forward." Margaret's response, sent the same day, "Ed, the subdivision has been here 40 years. If the lake was a water source, we'd know by now. This is decorative. Thanks for your concern." Ed never responded. He'd assumed Margaret would verify like any responsible person would. She didn't. The county commissioners called a public hearing 2 weeks after the story broke. More than 200 people showed up, residents, reporters, county officials. The hearing was held in the high school auditorium because the community center wasn't big enough. I sat in the third row with Ed and Marcus. Rachel Torres sat in the press section, laptop open, taking notes. Margaret testified first, flanked by her attorney, a sharp-looking man in a gray suit who'd been hired the day after the criminal investigation was announced. The lake treatment was approved by a licensed county inspector, Margaret said, reading from a prepared statement. "I followed all proper procedures. The accusations being made are based on outdated documents and are intended to damage my reputation." County attorney, a woman named Claire Mendoza, stood up. "Ms. Westfield, the inspector who signed the permit is your brother-in-law. Did you disclose that conflict of interest?" Margaret hesitated. "He's a professional. Our family relationship is irrelevant." "Did you disclose it?" "No." "Did you know the lake is classified as a municipal water source under the 1947 easement?" "I was told it was decorative." Ed Callahan stood up from his seat. "That's not true." Every head in the room turned toward him. Claire Mendoza nodded at Ed. "Mr. Callahan, you have something to add?" "I told her personally," Ed said, his voice steady. "I sent her an email in April 2023 warning her about the water source. She ignored it." Margaret's attorney leaned over and whispered something to her. She shook her head. "I don't recall that email," Margaret said. Linda Ortiz, the auditor, stood up from the audience. "I have a copy. It's part of the HOA's server. Records." She handed a printed copy to Claire Mendoza. Claire read it aloud, Ed's warning. Margaret's dismissive response. The room went silent. "You were warned," Claire said, looking at Margaret. "And you proceeded anyway." Margaret's face had gone pale. Brian Westfield testified next. He looked smaller than I'd imagined, mid-50s, thinning hair, nervous hands. He admitted he'd signed the permit without independently verifying the lake's classification. "Margaret told me it was a decorative pond," he said. I trusted her. That was a mistake." "Did you inspect the site before signing the permit?" Claire asked. "No." "Did you check county records to verify the water source status?" "No, why not?" Brian looked down. "She's family." "I trusted her." Claire Mendoza's expression hardened. "You signed a permit authorizing chemical treatment of a water source without verifying what that source was. Because your sister-in-law asked?" "You too?" Brian nodded. "That's a conflict of interest, Mr. Westfield, and it's a violation of your duties as a county inspector." 3 days later, an attorney named David Park announced a class action lawsuit on behalf of Clearwater Estates residents. 127 families joined as plaintiffs, the defendants, the HOA board, Margaret Westfield personally, Brian Westfield, and Westfield Green Solutions. The claims: negligence, environmental contamination, health damages, and property devaluation damages sought, $2.5 million. Margaret called another emergency board meeting. Only 15 people showed up. Most residents had stopped attending. They didn't trust her anymore. Jennifer Hayes was there. She stood up during public comment and walked to the front of the room, holding a framed photo of her daughter Emma. "My daughter was in the hospital for 3 days," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "She's 7 years old. She drank poisoned water because you didn't tell us what you were doing." Margaret stared at the table. "I didn't poison anyone. This is a misunderstanding." Marcus stood up next to his wife. "You knew the lake was a water source? Ed warned you? You ignored it because you wanted your fountain and your property value boost." "I was improving the community," Margaret said, her voice rising. "You were improving your bank account," Marcus shot back. $90,000 to your own company, funded by our HOA dues?" Jennifer's voice cut through. "You don't even drink the water. You only drink bottled." A resident in the Baca. Woman named Carol stood up. "When did you stop drinking tap water, Margaret?" Margaret hesitated. "I've always preferred filtered." "When?" Carol pressed. "What year?" Margaret looked trapped. "Maybe 2022? Before you started the lake treatment?" Silence. The implication hung in the air, heavy and damning. Margaret had suspected the water came from the lake. She'd switched to bottled water, and then she'd poisoned it anyway. Susan Chen, the treasurer and Margaret's sister, stood up. "I resign, effective immediately." She walked out. Mark Torres, the vice president, followed. "I trusted Margaret. I didn't know about the water source. I resign." Margaret sat alone at the board table, surrounded by empty chairs. 2 days later, the county prosecutor held a press conference. "We are pursuing criminal charges against Margaret Westfield for reckless endangerment and contamination of a municipal water supply," she said. "We are also pursuing charges against Brian Westfield for misconduct in office and conflict of interest violations." Margaret faced up to 5 years in prison and a $50,000 fine. I watched the press conference on my laptop, sitting on Samuel's porch. The lake behind me was still dead, no fish, no herons, no life. But the water was being tested daily now, and the EPA had started a remediation plan. Margaret's voice echoed in my head, the voicemail she'd left. "You've destroyed this community." No, I thought. You did. 150 families couldn't drink their water. 7 kids had gotten sick. 3 elderly residents were hospitalized, and Margaret still thought she was the victim. Margaret pleaded no contest 3 weeks later. The criminal charges had come down fast. Margaret Westfield was charged with 2 misdemeanors, reckless endangerment and improper permitting. Brian Westfield was charged with conflict of interest and misconduct in office. Both pleaded no contest. Margaret was sentenced to a $15,000 fine, 200 hours of community service, and 2 years of probation. Brian lost his county job, paid a $10,000 fine, and was permanently barred from doing inspection work anywhere in the state. The civil case moved faster. The HOA's insurance carrier took one look at the evidence of the emails. The financial audit, Ed's testimony. The lab results unsettled the class action lawsuit for $1.8 million. Average payout per household, $. Margaret's personal assets were seized to cover her portion of the judgment, $200,000. That included her house on Lakeview Drive. It was foreclosed and sold at auction within 60 days. Her landscaping company, Westfield Green Solutions, declared bankruptcy. The $90,000 contract was voided. Margaret moved out of state in late November. I heard through Ed that she'd gone to Ohio to live with relatives. She left. Clearwater Estates in disgrace. No apologies. No acknowledgement of what she'd done. Her final statement, released through her attorney, read, "I acted in good faith to improve community standards. I am the victim of a media witch hunt and false accusations. I hope the community can move forward without further division." Even at the end, she couldn't admit she was wrong. The state EPA funded a $120,000 lake restoration project. Over 8 weeks, the chemicals were flushed out through the natural spring flow. The dead fish were removed. Water was tested daily. By early December, the EPA certified the water safe for human consumption. In January, they restocked the lake base, bluegill, catfish, native species, the same ones that had lived here for decades. I stood on the dock and watched the fish being released. Silver flashes disappearing into water that was finally clear again. Clearwater Estates elected a new HOA board in December. Marcus Hayes was voted in as president. Ed Callahan agreed to serve as an advisor. Jennifer Hayes took the treasurer position. Their first official action, a transparency policy. All HOA contracts would be publicly bid. Financial statements would be posted online every month. No more backroom deals. Second action. Any work involving the lake or water system required an independent environmental review before approval. Third action. A formal apology to me. All fines and violations were removed from the record. My dock was officially permitted. No fees, no hassles. The HOA sent a letter signed by Marcus, Ed, and Jennifer. We're sorry for what you went through. You were right. Margaret was wrong. Thank you for standing up when no one else would. The class action settlement paid me $14,000. I used it to cover the $8,000 in back taxes, the $404 lab testing, and the legal consultation fees I'd racked up. What was left went into fixing up the cabin, new roof, fresh paint, repairs Samuel had been putting off for years. The property was finally clear, fully paid mine. By spring, the lake was alive again. I caught the first bass in 9 months on a Tuesday morning in March. 2 pounds, dark green, fighting hard. I held it for a moment, felt its weight, then released it back into the water. Felt like a beginning. Neighbors started coming by to apologize. People I'd never met, people who'd believed Margaret's story, people who'd thought I was the problem. I didn't know she was lying, one man said. We thought you were just some outsider trying to cause trouble. I didn't hold it against them. Margaret had been convincing. That's how people like her operate. Kids started fishing from my dock again with permission this time. I'd see them in the evenings, casting lines, catching bluegill. It reminded me of being 8 years old, learning to fish with Samuel. The herons came back. The turtles returned to the fallen log. The dragonflies reappeared. The lake remembered what it was supposed to be. One evening in late April, Ed came by with a 6-pack of beer. We sat on the dock, feet hanging over the edge, watching the sunset turn the water gold. Your grandfather would have fought this the same way, Ed said. I wish I'd helped him when he was fighting it, I said. Ed shook his head. He didn't want to burden you. He knew it was his fight. He took a sip of beer, but he also knew it wouldn't end with him. That's why he left you that note. He knew this lake mattered not just for fish, but for truth. Margaret wanted control. I said she didn't care what she destroyed to get it, Ed finished. People like that always think they're doing the right thing, right up until everything collapses. Clearwater Estates became a cautionary tale in HOA management circles. A regional HOA conference held a session titled When Boards Ignore Facts. Lessons from the Clearwater case. Rachel Torres wrote a follow-up article about it. 3 other HOAs in the county discovered similar water source issues after reading her story and fixed them proactively. Margaret's disaster had prevented others. 2 years later, I was still living in the cabin. I'd renovated it, new kitchen, updated bathroom, refinished floors. It felt like mine now, not just Samuel's. The lake was crystal clear, teeming with life. The fishing was better than it had been in years. Marcus ran the HOA professionally, no drama, no overreach, just basic maintenance and transparent governance. The neighborhood was peaceful. One Saturday morning, I was on the dock rigging a fishing rod when I heard footsteps behind me. Excuse me, I turned. It was a little girl, maybe 8 years old, holding a pink fishing rod that looked brand new. Her mother stood a few steps back, Jennifer Hayes. My mom said you might teach me how to fish, the girl said. Her name was Emma. Same kid who'd been hospitalized. I'd be happy to, I said. I showed her how to tie on a hook, how to bait it, how to cast without tangling the line. 20 minutes later, she caught a bluegill, small, shimmering, perfect. She squealed with excitement. Jennifer watched from the shore, smiling. When Emma ran over to show her the fish, Jennifer looked at me. Thank you for fighting, she said. We almost lost everything because we didn't know. Margaret knew, I said. She just didn't care. Jennifer nodded, then walked Emma back up the hill toward their house. That evening, I sat alone on the dock at sunset, rod in hand. The water was glass smooth, reflecting the orange sky. I thought about Samuel, about the 1947 easement he'd kept. In a folder for 70 years, about the note he'd left me. The lake remembers everything, so should you. Margaret had poisoned the lake for a fountain and higher property values. She'd known the water came from here. She'd switched to bottled water while everyone else kept drinking poison. It took a journalist, a union organizer, a retired surveyor, and 150 poisoned families to stop her. And when it all collapsed, when the evidence was undeniable, when her house was foreclosed and she lost everything she called herself, the victim, I cast my line into the water and felt the familiar tug almost immediately. I set the hook and reeled in a 3-pound bass, healthy and strong. I held it for a moment, then released it back into the lake. Margaret was gone. The lake was alive. Everyone in Clearwater Estates knew where their water came from now. Looked out across the water, watching the ripples fade. Turns out truth doesn't poison easily.